Well, hello. Thanks for joining us for the Virtual Farm Science Review. My name is Robin Wilson. I'm a professor in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit about a project focused on understanding climate adaptation decisions in the Eastern Corn Belt. This was a project funded by the USDA through the National Institutes of Food and Ag. And the goal of this project really was to understand what sort of impacts farmers are experiencing, what sort of impacts they might expect in the future, how they're already adapting or may adapt in the future to these changes, and how those decisions might vary across the landscape. And ultimately, we'll be using that understanding of the farmer decision-making process to link it into some models that allow us to kind of imagine what the future might look like if farmers are adapting in these different ways to these climate exacerbated impacts. What might that mean for the variety of ecosystem services provided by agriculture or the agroecosystem in the Eastern Corn Belt? What does that mean for food production? What does it mean for water quality? What does it mean for our ability to sequester carbon in the soil? And so this piece that I'll present today is part of a much bigger project, and I'll focus more on just this understanding of farmer decisions, but hopefully at the end circle back to tell you a little bit about how it might link back into these bigger questions about what it means for the region when it comes to the services provided and the sorts of policies and programs that might be most effective at not only helping farmers adapt to these climate impacts, but also ensuring that we can continue to produce food while also protecting these other services that are provided by the agroecosystem. So you might have guessed that I am not a soil scientist. I am not an agronomist. I am not someone who thinks about these things from that perspective, but I'm a social scientist. And I am specifically a behavioral decision scientist, which just means I study how people make decisions under risk and uncertainty. And I've been doing a lot of work in this space around farmer decisions, around conservation decisions, around these climate adaptation decisions, thinking about how farmers might manage the landscape in ways that could positively or negatively impact others in the region. And so I'm going to jump right in and just talk a little bit about the motivation for this project. The original motivation really came from this understanding that climate change is happening, it's real, and it's gonna impact us, not only in the Eastern Corn Belt, but across the Midwest, across the US and across the globe. And some of these impacts might be positive. We might see a kind of lengthening of the growing season, and there might be opportunities there for double cropping. But some of these impacts are also going to be a little more challenging or perhaps a little bit more difficult to manage sustainably. And so this is just an infographic that our climate team put together. You can access this on our project website, which I will provide at the end of the talk. And it just paints a bit of a picture of what we think the future might look like under expected climate change. And so what you see at the top are kind of predictions about temperature and how that might impact when freezes occur in the spring and fall. And then in the bottom half, what you see are our expectations about precipitation, both in terms of total precipitation that might be received annually, but also when that precipitation is coming. So 1 day maximum events, annual days with more than an inch of precipitation. And what you see in blue is our current range. So this is kind of the status quo and what we're used to. Mean daily minimums ranging from 30 to 45 degrees, mean daily maximums ranging from 55 to 70, right? When you look at temperature. What you see in the gold is kind of best case scenario under climate change. So under the most positive emission scenarios where we see the most minimal global changes in climate, that's what the gold bars represent. And under higher emission scenarios where we might say it's kind of worst case scenario or the biggest changes in global climate, that's what those predictions correspond to. So overall, what we can expect for the Eastern Corn Belt is that it's going to get wetter. So if you look at precipitation at the bottom, you can see that even under the best case or the worst case scenario, we're going to have greater totals in annual precipitation. Again, this is probably a good thing in a lot of ways for agriculture. Where it becomes problematic is we expect more variation in when that precipitation occurs. So you can see that we expect an increase in those annual 1 day maximum events up to potentially as high as 5.4 inches. You can also see we expect more days where we would get greater than 1 inch of precipitation. So we're going to get more rain. Is it going to come evenly spread across the year? Is it going to come when we need it most? For instance, in the summer? No, that's not necessarily going to be the case. we might see these much bigger rainfall events in the spring, like we have been starting to experience, and we might see these short dry periods in the summer. Then when it comes to temperature, looking at that top half, again, it's gonna get warmer. So not only is it gonna get wetter, it's gonna get warmer. And what we see here, again, are kind of variations in how much warmer that, that temperature increase might be. And in fact, one of the things we know too associated with this is that we'll see a lot of increases in our nighttime temperatures. And then we also will expect some shifts in the date of the last spring freeze and the date of the first fall freeze. So you can see that depending on where we fall, we could get a much longer growing season, but it could have impacts on planting and harvesting. And so because of these concerns, we've started to think about, you know, what is it going to take for farmers to really manage these changes in a way that is sustainable and resilient for agriculture in this region. So we had really kind of 3 research questions that framed this project. How are farmers likely to adapt to these climate-induced risks and uncertainties? How will these changes in land use and management influence the sustainability and resilience of the agroecosystem? And then finally, what policies and programs would best balance agricultural production with protection of critical ecosystem services? So I laid this out a bit, but what I'm really going to focus on today is this first question. So how are farmers likely to adapt to these climate-induced risks and uncertainties? Again, I'll try to explain at the end how we're going to take this understanding of farmer adaptation and tie it in to answer these other questions. But today I'll just focus on some insights that we gained from a recent survey of farmers across the Eastern Corn Belt. So just a little bit about this survey. We purchased a sample from Farm Market ID. If you're someone who's ever received a survey from Ohio State, perhaps from Purdue or Michigan State or any of the other land grants, there's a lot of different ways that we put those samples together. One way is that we can purchase a random sample of names and mailing addresses from this company, Farm Market ID, who is also perhaps the company behind other things that show up in the mail at your house. And so we asked them for a sample of corn and soybean farmers, stratified by farm size, meaning we didn't just want a random sample of farmers or operations across our geographic area, but we wanted to basically kind of undersample the small farms and oversample the big farms, meaning we wanted to end up with enough operations in our sample to represent the kind of landscape that's out there being managed. If we just randomly sampled from just all of the operations, we would end up with a lot of people in our survey who ran pretty small operations and very few on the kind of larger end of the scale. So we kind of adjusted for that to make sure that we could get a critical mass of some of these larger farms participating as well. And we didn't sample across the entire Eastern Corn Belt. We actually sampled from 5 representative watersheds, 1 in each of the 5 states that were the focus of our region. So you can see that here in Ohio, we focused on the Lower Maumee, and then we picked kind of similar watersheds in terms of composition, land use, type of agriculture across the other 4 states as well. We administered the survey by mail using the Dillman method, which is just a kind of approved method to best recruit people to participate in these types of mail surveys. We collected this data during this kind of window of opportunity, late summer into early fall, trying to catch people after a lot of the summer activities had ended, but before harvest was in full swing. We ended up with about 918 usable returns, so an adjusted response rate of about 27%. Certainly we love for these response rates to be a little higher in the kind of 40 to 50% range even, but we've actually seen a drop in these response rates over time, which makes it difficult for us sometimes to draw conclusions about what farmers are doing and how farmers are thinking. And so again, for those of you who might receive a survey in the mail, I encourage you to participate and respond to it because it's really helpful for researchers, and hopefully you'll see those returns to you in terms of how you're engaged in these issues, the types of programs and policies that are developed based on these insights that you can provide through participating in these projects. So we had a lot of questions in this survey, but the real core of it was this little, I guess you can call it an experiment, but where we presented farmers with a variety of different scenarios. So we said, you know, imagine a world where instead of current payment rates, you would receive a different amount per acre for land that you enrolled in a land retirement program. And suppose that this would be in place for 8 out of the next 10 years or 5 out of the next 10 years. So again, varying the amount of time that these sorts of conditions would be in place. And then we presented some of these variations that I already shared with you around climate change in terms of planting date, average rainfall during the growing season and harvesting date. So imagine that your planting date was typical and your average rainfall was typical. But maybe imagine that your harvesting date was 30 days earlier than usual. What would you do? So basically we're trying to present people, paint a picture, you know, if the future looked different, if your planting date shifted, your harvesting date shifted, your average rainfall shifted, if the kind of incentives for enrolling land and retirement programs changed, if those conditions were in place, you know, kind of 50% of the time versus 80% of the time over the next 10 years, what might you do different? So farmers could select from a variety of different practices, and they could say, you know, I wouldn't do anything different. Or they could say, you know, I would change my rotation to allow for double cropping. Or I would install more tile drainage and change my crop insurance coverage, right? So these are the sorts of options that we gave them, which were identified by our stakeholder advisory team as some of the perhaps most relevant and adaptations of greatest interest to our advisory team. And so what happened is farmers were given kind of random combinations of these scenarios. The baselines were always standardized to that state of interest. So the planting date, harvesting date, average rainfall was specific to the state of Ohio if you were an Ohio farmer, specific to the state of Michigan if you're a Michigan farmer. But then the variations that they were presented with were standardized. So farmers could get any random combination of no change in the status quo. So typical planting, typical harvesting date, typical growing season rainfall, typical conservation payment, or they could get some sort of a variation. So a planting or harvesting date that's 30 days earlier, a planting date that's 45 days later, a harvesting date that's 50 days later, plus or minus 10 or 15 inches of total rainfall, plus or minus $100 on that typical conservation payment. And then I mentioned that we kind of varied how often would we expect these conditions to be in place. Is there a 50-50 chance that the world looks a little different over the next 10 years, or is it more often than not, right? 8 out of 10 years. So farmers were presented with, I believe, 3 of these different sorts of scenarios, different combinations of these conditions. And here's just a little bit of info about the types of farmers who participate in this survey. Again, we kind of oversampled for the bigger farms, purposefully trying to better represent more of the management decisions on more of the acreage across these 5 watersheds. And so the average total farm size was just over 1,000 acres. Just over 20% of farmers reported that they were planting a cover crop. But if they were doing that, they were only doing that on about 20% of their total planted acres. The average age was about 64 years. The average number of generations their family has farmed was about 3. And 64% expected to pass their farm on to a family member. So that gives you a bit of a snapshot of who we're representing with the rest of the data that I'm about to share with you. And so I'll just summarize a few things from what we learned. About 30% of our respondents we could categorize as the never adapters. So these were people that, regardless of what scenario they were presented with, they opted to never do anything different. These were individuals who kept picking that last option and saying, no, I wouldn't change anything. I wouldn't change anything. So no matter what those future weather conditions were, no matter what those conservation payments were, no matter if they were going to be in place 5 out of 10 years or 8 out of 10 years, these were individuals who said, nah, I'm not changing anything. What we see about this approximately third of our participants is that they were older, farming for longer, and were more likely to have more traditional practices in place on their operations. So used more conventional tillage, for example, as opposed to conservation or no-till. That remaining approximately 2/3, about 72% of respondents, adapted at least once. So in at least one of the 3 scenarios they were presented with, they chose to at least change one thing in response to something in one of those scenarios. And what we saw for these individuals is they tended to be the larger farms. So there's definitely an advantage and a kind of perhaps greater ease of making these changes for those with these kind of greater economies of scale. These were individuals who also had a greater probability of already having crop insurance. These were individuals who reported experiencing more of these climate impacts already. These were also individuals who were more concerned generally about climate change and who had a stronger kind of identity as a conservationist. When they thought about what made up a good farmer, these were individuals who thought that good farmers are ones who thought about the health of local waterways and, you know, were concerned about the health of their soil and thought about these kind of bigger picture issues. So we definitely saw some differences, and that the individuals who are likely to respond to these potential future conditions had certain sets of characteristics or traits that were somewhat predictable. Interestingly, then there was an even smaller group of that 72%, and I'm sorry, I forgot to put the number in here, and I'm blanking on it off the top of my head, that we'll call the multiple adapters. So these were individuals who not only adapted at least once, but adapted multiple times to multiple scenarios or put multiple adaptations in place. And what we saw here is that multiple adapters were often responding to the increased probability of experiencing those conditions. So if they had a scenario where it said, oh, this is 8 out of the next 10 years, they were much more likely to put these multiple adaptations in place, perhaps because of more certainty about these conditions being something they actually would have to plan for. We also saw that these individuals were more educated on average. Again, similar to the kind of sometimes adapters in general, had experienced more of these climate impacts already, but also had plans to pass on their farm to a family member. So had a kind of succession plan in place, which I thought was kind of interesting too, that again, perhaps they're thinking a little more long-term because they actually have family members who they hope will take on that operation. So among those who made at least one adaptation in at least one scenario, 4 of the options were the most popular. So the most popular was installing more drainage tile. You can imagine this is because in some of these scenarios, you were faced with a world with a lot more water. And so people being concerned about getting that water off the landscape and not interfering with their in-field activities. The next popular was increasing their use of no-till or conservation tillage. Next was enrolling more land in conservation programs. So taking that kind of retirement strategy versus adapting their kind of existing operation in terms of land management. And then the fourth most popular was changing the crop insurance coverage. So we did see a handful of people, about 5%, who said they'd invest in new or additional irrigation. We saw about 5% who said they would change the rotation to allow for double cropping. These might have been people who were presented with that scenario where the planting date moved up and the harvesting date moved back, and you had this longer growing season. But again, about 50%, across all of these scenarios consistently were saying, I don't know that I would change anything in a given kind of instance or opportunity to make a change. And so what I'm going to summarize here is to try to paint the picture of kind of several statistical models that we ran, trying to understand differences in kind of who's adapting, differences in what they're choosing and why. And so what you see here on the left in the column are the variety of characteristics or variables that we measured in our survey. And we ran a regression model that just means we were trying to explain everything you see in the rest of the columns. So decisions to adapt in some way is that kind of far right column called some change. And then the 4 kind of columns in the middle are those specific adaptation decisions that people made. To change their insurance, to put more land in no-till, to install more drainage tile, or to put some of their land in a kind of more traditional conservation retirement program. And so what we did with these models is we tried to explain, what's your probability of putting some change in place given these characteristics and variables on the left? What's the probability of you perhaps making one of these specific adaptation decisions given these characteristics on the left? So I'll point out a few kind of trends or patterns. First of all, one of the most consistent predictors of these decisions was operating a larger farm. So not only was there a greater likelihood of an individual putting at least some change in place as that farm got bigger, but they were also more likely then to specifically choose to retire land, to install drainage tile, or to put more land in no-till. Interestingly, farm size didn't change whether or not you would reconsider your current insurance coverage. But it did have this consistent positive effect across a lot of the other decisions that we explored here. Also, interestingly, we have these kind of bank of what I call farmer characteristics. So these are things like whether or not the individual reported having experienced those climate impacts, how educated they were, how long they'd been farming, how concerned they were about climate change in general, how strong that identity was as a conservationist when they thought about their role as a farmer. And interestingly, those farmer characteristics were pretty consistent explanations of whether or not a farmer would put some change in place. And they were also pretty consistent explanations for choosing to put that land into retirement, but they weren't so helpful at explaining why a farmer might choose to change their insurance coverage, put more land in no-till, or install more drainage tile. And so you almost see this tendency for, there are certain types of individuals with certain characteristics who are going to do something. And those individuals are also more likely to opt into some sort of a retirement program. But those characteristics do not make those individuals more likely to do any of these other specific adaptations. What makes us, helps us understand those specific adaptations tend to be more of these climate and policy variables. So you can see that the specific expected duration of change, the later planting date, the later harvest date, whether or not there's more rainfall, changes in conservation payments, didn't have as much to do with whether or not a farmer would put some change in place. You do see that obviously increased conservation payments is going to be a motivation to do something different, and probably then to retire that land. You can also see that the later planting date was one of the bigger kind of climate drivers of change. But generally speaking, these climate and policy variables helped us better understand why someone might change their insurance coverage, why they might put in, adopt more no-till, why they might put in more drainage tile. So just picking drainage tile as an example, you can see that as the planting dates got later and the harvest dates got earlier, which is what that dash means. Oops, slide keeps moving. And as the rainfall got greater, we saw a greater tendency for farmers who were putting at least some change in place to choose to install more drainage tile. So again, I think what these results paint is a bit of a picture that there's certainly an advantage to operating a larger farm in terms of your ability to adapt to these expected future conditions. There is certainly something about that individual farmer that might make them more willing to even consider these changes. But when it comes to those specific changes they might put in place, farmers really seem to be thoughtfully considering, what is going to be going on with those planting and harvesting dates in that rainfall, and what should I be doing in order to best manage those changes in the future. I apologize, my door slammed and that kind of surprised me for a second. Just want to wrap up with a few conclusions and implications that I think you might find of interest. So future climate in the Eastern Corn Belt region is expected to bring longer growing seasons, higher temperatures, and more rainfall, but most importantly, which we've experienced a bit here these last few years, is more variable rainfall. So again, picture big spring rains, perhaps drier periods in the summer. However, despite these expectations that we're starting to experience and we expect to continue into the future, concern about climate change among Eastern Corn Belt farmers and interest in adaptation is pretty low. So when we look kind of descriptively, on average, how concerned are farmers? How likely are they to adapt? It's still pretty low. So either these impacts haven't been big enough yet to really increase that motivation, or perhaps we're not communicating them clearly, or drawing those connections that are necessary to think about how to adapt to manage these impacts moving forward. Interestingly, the majority of our farmers do report believing that climate change is occurring. So about 75% said they know climate change is occurring. Some believe it's from human caused reasons, some believe it's natural, but by far the majority believe it's occurring. So it's not for a lack of thinking that these changes are happening, but it seems to be more related to whether or not those changes have been impactful in a way that points to kind of obvious changes that could be made that would actually minimize the negative impact of those changes in the future. And like I said, those who adapt have bigger farms, they have more experience. They're the ones that really have been probably negatively impacted in the past, perhaps by these fluctuations in rainfall. At an individual level, they are more concerned personally about climate change and conservation in general. But interestingly, we see this kind of two-stage decision where first farmers are saying, should I adapt or not? So you've painted this picture of the future, you've given me the scenario, should I adapt? And whether or not that individual adapts seems to be driven more by these individual differences. So things like education, age, climate concern. But that second decision, what specifically should I do, seems to be explained more by those expected climate impacts, where farmers are kind of saying, I'm someone who's concerned about this, I should do something. And then they're looking at those future conditions and saying, okay, what do I need to do to manage that more thoughtfully and more carefully? So for instance, when there's more rain, we see farmers wanting to put in more drainage tile, maybe taking land out of retirement and putting less land in no-till. When those planning dates get later, we see farmers opting to change their insurance coverage and again, install more drainage tile. When those harvest dates get later, we're seeing people actually want to take some of that drainage tile out. So we're seeing them kind of respond again to these specific climate related variables when they're choosing what they would do in the future under these expected conditions. So if we want to move forward thoughtfully in this space, a couple things I think we can think about. One, concern about climate change in general, concern about climate exacerbated impacts, and the need for conservation must be increased to encourage adaptation. So remember, it's this two-stage decision. First, farmers are saying, do I even need to adapt? And what we see is that initial decision to adapt is more likely among those who are concerned about these issues and really feel a personal responsibility to make a change. And so we really have to have that piece in place. So part of this could be kind of building more of a culture of conservation among farmers across the Eastern Corn Belt. Some of this might be being more clear about what we expect these impacts to be and how they're relevant to agriculture. Perhaps it's highlighting how some of the recent experiences we've had in agriculture are tied to climate change. And so these kind of catastrophic years we've had where people are flooded out in the spring, that's going to happen more often in the future. So perhaps it's being more clear about that so farmers can start to think about, okay, well, what do I need to do in order to navigate that? And then ultimately, once we've engaged people in that conversation and they want to consider a change, they want to think about what's necessary, the advice we give on specific adaptations should be tied to those likely impacts and what is going to be most feasible and effective for that individual to navigate them. So assuming we think that these impending changes associated with climate are going to impact farmers in the Eastern Corn Belt, then we need to be thinking about how to engage them more proactively and how to provide advice on how to navigate these pieces as well. And so I said that I would tie this a little bit to the kind of bigger project to wrap up. So the next steps in this project are kind of looking at this bigger question. So in the face of climate risks and uncertainties that influence farmer adaptations, what set of policies and programs might balance agricultural production with critical ecosystem services and achieve a more sustainable and resilient agroecosystem? And so this is the bigger kind of question of the project. And so we're going to take these results, we're going to take what we've learned about farmer decision-making in this context, and we're going to try to answer this bigger question of what is it going to take to really help farmers navigate these potential futures and make sure that we can continue to produce the food that needs to be produced, but also protect these other services that are provided. And so we're taking our understanding of farmer adaptation, these farmer decision-making models, and we're going to link them into a lot of other models that represent not only changes in the regional climate, but changes in the regional economy, the impact that farmer land use and land management decisions have on local environmental conditions. Again, whether that's sequestering carbon in the soil or water quality. And then we're going to think about, in collaboration with our stakeholder advisory team, what sort of policies, what sort of programs, what sort of interventions, what type of engagement can we put in place that's going to help us better navigate this future where it gets warmer, wetter, and wilder. You might have heard Dr. Aaron Wilson use that phrasing before if you've heard him speak. In this future where we want to balance a variety of services that are provided by the agroecosystem, and in a world where there are these external influences in terms of economy and trade that are playing into this picture as well. So this is where we're heading. If you're interested in this, certainly check out our website. Let us know if we can keep you in the loop as we move forward in this project. But I just want to say thank you again for taking the time to participate virtually in Farm Science Review. I hope that you found this of interest and useful. A big thank you to NIFA for the funding to do this research, to our project team of OSU folks who have been super helpful in even just getting our survey off the ground, not to mention all the other components that the other team members are running. And of course to our stakeholder advisory team, which is a very dedicated group of folks with interest in agriculture and the environment who are again helping us step by step in the way we pursue these questions. Here's a link to our project website where you can go and you can download that infographic on climate impacts. We post PowerPoints and other products as they are put together. And of course, you're always welcome to reach out to me if you have questions or interested in any of this. So thanks again for your time and have a great day.